You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
This episode of Social Europe podcast is brought to you by the New School for Social Research. The New School for Social Research is a world-renowned graduate school in New York City, offering master's and doctoral programs in the social sciences and humanities. New School students and faculty work to understand social problems through progressive interdisciplinary scholarship and create new ideas in the world. To learn more about the New School for Social Research, visit newschool.edu/nssr. Hello everybody and welcome to Social Europe Podcast episode 51. My name is Henning, Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe. Today I'm in conversation with Guy Standing, who is a British Professor of Development Studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and Guy is also co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network. Together we are discussing the ideas in his most recent book called The Plunder of the Commons, a Manifesto for Sharing Public Wealth. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, hello Guy. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time today to talk to me about the plunder of the commons, the topic of your most recent book. And, for people who might not be in that subject very much, could you maybe start by explaining what exactly do you mean by the commons? What has the historic role been of the commons?
The commons, the commons are essentially public resources, the nature, the social amenities that we inherit, the civil institutions, everything which is not private property and not state property. We also have an idea of commoning, the verb to common, which is to act in the commons and through shared activities. And the commons have always been very important throughout history. And what the book does is show that at the beginning of the British Constitution, there was a Charter of the Forest, which effectively enshrined the rights of the commons, the rights of commoners to subsist in the commons, to have access to the means of work and for a home and the means of subsistence. So the commons has always been an important part of our society. And one of the problems is that over time, over the many centuries, there have been various forms of plunder, various forms by which the commons have been taken away from commoners, us, all of us, because the commons in the end belongs to everybody, but belongs to nobody, paradoxically. And today we are seeing a new plunder, a new form of depletion of our commons, and that I think is the fundamental challenge we have before us.
So, is the Charter of the Forest that you mentioned? Is this the sort of first document actually enshrining this right to the commons?
Yes, and it was sealed in November 1217 in St Paul's Cathedral in London, the original St Paul's. And I don't think it would have been sealed had it not been the fact that the king at the time was 10 years old and he probably didn't understand what was being done in his name. But it was a remarkably subversive document because it returned large parts of the land to the commoners that had been taken by successive monarchs and by successive aristocrats. And it was the first charter, an environmental charter, that asserted the need to preserve nature at the same time as allowing the commoners to exist in the commons. And you can see it as establishing the whole set of principles of the commons, which then, of course, have been defended and attacked in various ways that I show in the book.
And, that this is the UK example where the commons have been enshrined in the Charter of the Forest. How was this done in other countries across Europe?
Well, when they had the 800th anniversary of the Charter of the Forest, I received an email from the American Bar Association, from a very senior member of the American Bar Association, and he said that the Charter of the Forest had been more influential in the defining of the American Constitution than the Magna Carta itself. And everybody knows about the Magna Carta, which was sealed on the same day as the Charter of the Forest in 1217. And the Charter of the Forest and the principles of commons have actually been, in all democracies, have been a part of the constitutions. And the commons, I think, is vitally important today because the agenda of neoliberalism, since Thatcher and Reagan began it, have been eroding the remaining commons. And it's very important to appreciate that this context has profoundly threatened what is a very rich commons that still exist. Essentially, what Thatcher did was, she said in that famous statement, "There is no such thing as society." And I point out in the book that I don't think she would have objected if the tense of the verb had been changed and it had read, "There should be no such thing as society." Because basically, she derived her economics, for whatever value you put on her economics, from Friedrich von Hayek. And Friedrich von Hayek was an adherent of the Austrian school of economics, of von Mises and so on. And the Mont Pelerin Society and all of those people who became influential in the 1970s and 1980s drew from the Austrian school. And an essential theorem of the Austrian school was and is that something that has no price has no value. And the commons, of course, has no price. We value our parks, we value the green, we value our water, we value the air, we value our social amenities like libraries and museums and things. They don't have a price. But we value them. But in their ideology, something that has no price can be given away or sold or commodified. And that has been the underlying ideological premise of what has been happening to our commons. So they have been allowing the privatization of our public amenities. They've been allowing the privatization and commodification of all forms of nature. And governments have no right to take our commons because the commons belong to all of us. And this is a plunder, a theft of the commons. And what I do in the book is look at the 5 types of commons. The natural commons, which is what most people think about when we talk about...
Let me take one step back before we come to the last sort of 40-odd years or so. So you mentioned that the Charter of the Forest was signed early in the 13th century. And then we got onto the Thatcher Revolution and how the economics of the Austrian school has influenced their thinking. So what happened in the meantime? What was this basically plain sailing, or have there been plunders before?
Yeah, there had been plunders throughout history since the 13th century. But the remarkable thing is that the Charter of the Forest was longer on the statute books, the British statute books, than any other piece of legislation in history. It was only reformed by a conservative government in 1971. So it was on the statute books. But throughout that period, there had been a struggle between those who wanted to take away the commons and those who defended the commons. Thus, we had the situation that the Tudors, the King Henry VIII and around them, they effectively took 8 million acres of land that had been commons and gave them to a new aristocratic elite in return for allegiance to the king. Then we had another period in the 17th century when more of the land was taken. Now, all of this time, there were struggles by the peasantry, struggles by workers to resist the loss of the commons. And we go back, and the great famous 1381 Peasants' Revolt was about trying to defend the commons against enclosure and it being taken away. And we go through into the 19th century when there were over 5,000 acts of parliament, which was an elite parliament, with 5,000 acts of enclosure, taking away another 7 million acres of land, common land, and giving it effectively to an aristocracy. So by the late 19th century, Britain had the most concentrated land ownership of any other country, and it has that today. So, for example, the biggest landowner in Britain today is a lovely name. He's the Duke of Buccleuch, and the Duke of Buccleuch inherited 277,000 acres of good land, and the only way he did it is he's the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of King Charles II in the 1660s. And he has that land, and a lot of other very big landowners have the land, and they've taken it. Now, what happened then is that not only was land concentrated, but all the resources on the land and under the land became privatized, if you like. But what Thatcher did was extend that. And she extended it, first of all, by taking school playgrounds and privatizing the state playgrounds. And then she privatized water. Water is a commons. Water is a commons, but she privatized all water supply in 1989, and it became private property. Private corporations were given monopolistic ownership of our water supply. And what happened then was that they piled up those corporations with debt, took the profits, gave them to foreign shareholders around the world, and private equity now owns our rivers. And the incredible thing is that to save costs, the water companies have been pouring untreated sewage into our rivers and into the sea. And as a consequence, today, a new report has just come out saying that no English river is safe to drink or to swim in. And it is an extraordinary thing that they've been breaking the law by this sewage works, but they've been making vast profits. So we had a privatization of water. And at the same time, Thatcher gave away 424,000 acres of common land to these new water companies. So that was the first step. Then we had the privatization of our railway system in 1993. Now, the railway system was part of our commons. It had been inherited, it was being built up, and it was part of our commons. They had no right to do that. And you go on and you see in area after area how what has been happening is the privatization, and far more importantly, and this is something that came across in writing of the book, what we've seen, and it's in other countries as well, not just Britain, is that in the process of privatizing our commons, it has led to the colonization of our commons. In other words, more and more of what we had as our commons have passed into the hands of foreign private equity. And this has dramatically altered the income distribution system, the ownership pattern, and the loss of our amenities, our libraries, our museums, our National Health Service has been largely privatized. We still think of the NHS as a public commons, but in actual fact, as I show in the book, most of what's been happening is that American private health companies and private equity have been taking more and more contracts from the National Health. Same thing with elder care and child care. Increasingly, they're not part of our commons. They're part of private profit making from foreign capital. So it's an extraordinary transformation of what has been happening to British society, and seeing it through the lens, seeing it through the commons is a very powerful way, because the commons has always tended to reduce inequality in Britain. And now what we're seeing is that the inequalities that have been taking place in Britain have been intensified by the loss of the commons. And that phenomenon is something that has not been taken into account in assessments of what's been happening to inequality in general.
Okay, and before we come to the effects of the plunder of the commons, you briefly already alluded to 5 types of the commons that you identify. Can you spell out again what these specific 5 types are?
Well, the first type is nature, natural commons. Now that includes the land, the water, the air, the seabed, the minerals under the land or under the water of the country. And in all of those respects, there has been this process of privatization and colonization. The second area is the social commons. Now, the social commons are defined as the facilities and amenities that have been inherited as part of society. They are something established in the past that have been inherited by our generations that belong to us in general. And where we've seen that taking place is, for example, council housing. Council housing has been largely privatized, so we have 2 million fewer council housing units today than we did in 1980. A huge loss of a social commons. Student accommodation is another form of social commons. It used to be part of the university system. The university system was part of our commons. But we've had a privatization of all student accommodation, so that today something like 80% of all student apartments are owned by foreign companies. And in particular, the biggest one is Goldman Sachs. So we have our student accommodation around the country largely owned by Goldman Sachs. It's an extraordinary development. But you can go on thinking of the biggest social trend in terms of the social commons has been what's called POPs, P-O-P-S. And what POPs are is privately owned public spaces. And what we've seen across the country, and it's in other countries as well, is that more and more the parts of our cities and towns have been privatized and sold to foreign property corporations. So large parts of central London that we've seen as part of our commons since they were there hundreds of years ago are now owned by private equity corporations from New York or from Malaysia, from China, and so on. And they have the right, under the existing legislation, to police their own areas. So we have, alongside the growth of POPs, you have private regulations, private control, so they can stop people like you and me going in squares and streets and their private parks, which we think are part of our commons, but in actual fact they have been lost. It's the same with things like urban trees. Every town and city in England and Wales and Scotland is famous for having trees alongside on the pavements, as you know. Well, what we don't appreciate is they've been privatizing the care of those trees, in effect privatizing what happens to those trees. And where that's happened, what's happening is that they're cutting down big trees, beautiful big trees, because they cost a lot to maintain, and they're putting small trees instead, or no trees, and we're having the character of our cities change because of the privatization of our commons. And you can see a lot of other social commons that have been lost. Libraries, public libraries that have been privatized or closed. And the railway system I mentioned earlier. So the chapter on the loss of the social commons, I think, is pretty comprehensive and shows what's been happening. The third form of commons that has been lost is the civil commons. And when I found myself reading that chapter again for my presentation next week at the LSE, I got most angry about that. The civil commons are the common law institutions, the common law principles inherited from Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. The idea that nobody should be found guilty of anything unless there's a proper trial, unless you have legal representation, unless there's due process. In other words, the person can have a chance to represent themselves or have a lawyer represent them and contest a charge. It's an extraordinary reality that we have had many developments in our legal system over the last 30 years, but particularly in the last 10 years, where due process has been lost. Today, for example, in our social policy, universal credit, a bureaucrat can sanction somebody and take away their benefits just on the basis that he thinks something has happened. Now, that, in fact, destroys someone's life. If you get no benefits because a bureaucrat has decided to take them away, it could lead you to suicide or mental breakdown because you've got no income, right? But it's being done without any legal process. It's just young bureaucrat who decides you don't have the right to have your benefit anymore. There's no proof, there's no evidence, there's no trial, right? It's hugely important for ordinary people, members of the precariat. The same with the privatization of litter cleaning in our streets. It's been privatized, and those private companies can literally on the spot, in the street, fine people for dropping a piece of paper. They can fine them £100 or £150, but there's no trial, there's no evidence. They can just do it. And what the evidence shows is that they've been targeting low-income people, vulnerable people who are in the street. And to lose £100 or £150 just for dropping a piece of paper could be destructive of their whole lifestyle. But they're doing it through a privatization process that, for me, is completely illegitimate loss of our civil commons. And the same thing with privatizing of our prisons. It's an extraordinary thing that the prisons are, in a sense, part of our commons. But if you privatize them, the private companies have an incentive to maximize the number of people they keep in prison because they're paid by the number of prisoners they have. They privatized the probation service. So the probation service has been really destroyed, in effect, so badly so that they're now having to admit they're going to take it back into public ownership next year. So it goes on with the loss of the civil commons. The next aspect is the loss of the cultural commons. Culture is inherently part of society. Public culture is part of every society. If you don't have public culture, you don't have society. But increasingly, the resources for our museums, our theatres, our public art have been cut, and they've been forcing them to adopt the American model of relying on multinational corporations and big donors for exhibitions, for museums, etc. And of course, if you do that, then they shape what is done in exhibitions and what is put on in shows and so on. And there's been a loss of the culture in many respects because in schools and in universities, the cultural subjects have been frozen out by the emphasis on human capital and job preparation. So music teaching in our secondary schools right across the country has virtually disappeared because it is part of our commons and is easily cut. And that's been happening. So you get a Philistine tendency in the erosion of your cultural commons. And finally, and very importantly, very much 21st century issue, we've seen a plunder of our knowledge commons, our information commons, which has been turned over largely to social media dominated by the big tech in the Silicon Valley, that they are dominant, plus the plutocracy owning our media, all our newspapers, and whereas local newspapers with the vernacular values of local things have been killed effectively. And we've been losing the intellectual commons because of the development of the US intellectual property rights system, with its patents and copyrights strengthened by the World Trade Organization, which has allowed rent seeking, which I've written a lot about, and in effect privatized ideas, which is a terrible development of modern times to a much greater extent than it used to be. And then finally, we've seen an erosion of our education commons. Our schools, our universities are increasingly commodified, commercialized, and geared to job seeking and away from teaching people to think critically about society. I believe that the loss of the education commons is a major cause of the drift to accepting populist, neo-fascist politicians and political agendas. We need to revive the education commons so that people can hear different perspectives and learn how to think critically. And you, I'm sure, understand much better than most how we find today more and more students are coming out unable to understand basic politics, unable to understand a critical, progressive way of thinking, because they're not taught that sort of thing in a commodified system. So we've lost all of those forms of commons. And I think seeing what's happening through the angle of the commons makes more people aware of the depth of the crisis and the need for us collectively to respond. And I believe that precariat understands that best, but also middle-class people. So there's a natural cross-class alliance for an agenda to recover the commons. And what I proposed in the book is a charter of the commons with 44 articles leading up to a demand that the commoners, you, me, and everybody else, should be compensated for the loss of our commons.
Okay, before we come to the solution, let me try to summarize what you analyzed in your 5 comments. So if I got you correctly, we basically had the situation that the natural commons were sold off, the social commons, the government abdicated responsibility for them. The civil commons introduced the legal inequality that you're just at the whim of whoever then decides to fine you. The cultural commons were just devaluated, and the knowledge and education commons were commercialized and put up with different incentives. I mean, you mentioned the university system. Especially in the university system, the reforms that we've seen over recent decades have set completely different incentives for students as well as for academics. Both of us worked at universities for a long time. We know this. So, and especially against the backdrop of what is happening, that this sort of specialized technical knowledge that is now being pushed at universities because, preparing you for the job market, might have a much shorter lifespan because developments are so quick. And even though, I think John Kay it was, who several years ago wrote a column in the Financial Times, say a liberal arts education now would serve you better in the long term.
That's right.
Yeah.
But of course, that's been frozen out. As you say, your summary was very, very pertinent because that's essentially it. I think the one thing that you didn't mention is that in all respects, in all 5 respects, what is emerging is the systematic colonization of all types of the commons, in the sense that with all those things that you've mentioned, have gone the increasing power of private equity capital and financial capital in taking the various commons, so that in effect the power and for exploitation and value extraction has passed to a global elite operating through the financial capital and operating through the financial institutions. And that, I think, is a really bad feature of what's happened.
I mean, against this backdrop, how do you see the situation in which we are currently, where a new commons is trying to be established, a digital commons?
Yeah.
Right? So there is a lively debate, especially in the digital realm, where there is a very clear conflict, very similar to what you described in all sorts of other areas, between commodified and commercialized interests, as well as a digital commons, access to free knowledge, and so on and so forth. So what's your take on the digital commons?
Well, I mean, that is covered under the Chapter 7 on the information commons. The digital commons, the domination by Google and Amazon and Facebook and so on, they are extracting enormous profits from us, the digital commons. Every time you and I go onto our computer, we are providing them with income because we are giving them information, personal data, right? They use our personal data to make huge profits by selling them to advertising companies. We know what's happening. They make billions of dollars from advertising using our data. The digital commons that we like to think with open source and open information and Wikipedia and so on is actually competing against a shrinking availability of open access data, because they are the big tech in Silicon Valley are dominating the way we receive social media and so on. And I think that comes to the part of the solution. We need a strategy to restore the digital commons, the information commons, and we need to demand a sharing of any profits that are made from the digital commons, from taking the digital commons. And that is in my final chapter, which is where I put forward my policy suggestions.
And interestingly, I mean, obviously some of these things are morphing in the realm of the digital, but we've had traditionally also some areas where I would probably think it would fall into a category, the plunder of the commons, where the business models are frankly absurd. Look at academic publishing in journals.
Of course.
Right. So that's always strikes me always as one of the most crass examples. The research is funded usually by public money, as professors are still mainly, employed by the state and by public universities. The results of that work are given away for free. It's being edited by your colleagues effectively for free. It's being, the added value, if you think about it economically, is almost negligible because you put it into a print template. That's all you do. And you sell it to the same institution that the originator of the work comes from, in this case, the library, for a markup that is just absurd.
Yeah. And the publishers, of course, make huge amounts of profits from us as writers or producers of material. But the tragedy of the loss of the education commons is that academics are being commodified. They're being commodified in different ways. If a star academic produces a MOOC, produces a standardized piece of work that is sold in huge numbers of copies, he or she will make a fortune. Okay, but it's standardized knowledge that is fixed and is just taught. It's not teaching people to think. And commodifying of academics includes the fact that people want to publish in peer-reviewed journals because that increases their income. So they write with the orthodoxy in mind, because only the orthodoxy control those journals. And therefore, it constrains people's thinking and gears them into a direction of selling themselves, selling their time. And of course, the teaching gets down prioritized. The ability to teach is constricted because the administration of universities are telling the professors and lecturers that they must give high grades and get people through and so on. So the whole process, in a sense, is corrupted by the commodification of schooling and education. And occasionally you see a brave academic objecting and standing up for it, and they usually end up by having their contract terminated. So we've got a system where the education commons has been captured by the neoliberal state, and the capacity of academics to have integrity in their commons has been lost. And this is a major crisis that we're facing today, and we need a strategy to fight back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the problem particularly in any books. It's really limited to these peer-reviewed academic journals, and it's actually hampering the production of new knowledge, because if you're a researcher and you don't happen to have a university affiliation, you have no access to the latest research.
That's right.
If you are a researcher in a developing country where the university cannot afford to subscribe to all these journals, you cannot be part of the academic discussion pushing forward your field of research. So it is actively a disincentive and actively a brake on innovation.
And it's a fragmenting of the community, because you get an elite, insiders who are taking the rental income and determining what is done. And then you get a huge precariat in academia and in teaching in general, with very, very bad contracts, not able to influence developments, crowded out of being able to get social mobility to move up in a system. And that is fundamentally different from the old guild character of education, where you went in and you climbed, and through your teaching and abilities, you would gradually move through the system. But today that model has crumbled, because most universities, if not all universities, are run by financiers, administrators who have no academic pretensions, no qualifications. And that goes through into secondary schools. Increasingly, we're seeing business school partnerships, which is ridiculous. And I document some of that, how it's happened in Britain. But the erosion of those things, erosion of a commons, erodes the ethics and the standards of the morality of a community, as well as increasing inequality.
Okay, maybe we could take this point to start looking into the potential solutions. So what can be done about it? I mean, especially if you're staying with the example of the university system, it is a catch-22, right? So why are researchers publishing in these journals? Well, because it's required for them to get a professorship and to be advanced in careers. So the university themselves would have to change the criteria according to which they promote and hire people, to set the disincentive to publish in these journals, which they have to spend an awful lot of money through their libraries to buy back, right? So it's a typical circular. It's a catch-22. So where would you start?
I would start by changing the governance of our education system. I think the governance has to be restored to the teachers and the students and the community, the parents and the community in general. We have to take back control of our schooling and education system for the community of educators and the community of learners. Unless that happens, a lot of the other things would get corrupted again. Then you start thinking, how do you prevent this credentialist approach, this commodification approach? But you've got to have a different governance structure. Unless the academics control a university, then these things will continue. unless students have a role in the voice of what they're learning and how they learn, then they're going to be produced as commodities. We produce so many people with so many degrees out and so on. So I think the governance structure is very, very important in that. And I think then that we have to control the surplus that the education institutions produce for education, so that what profits are being made are channeled back into education, not into the pockets of the Koch brothers or the billionaires who are perverting our schooling system and our education system, particularly in the United States.
Okay, and if you look at, you mentioned the severe inequality effects of the plunder of the commons in different areas. So how would you go about reversing some of these developments and establish a more balanced future?
Okay, what I'm proposing, and this is the last two articles of my 44-article Charter of the Commons in the book, right? But I think they're fundamental. What I'm proposing is that all commercial profits that stem from using our commons should be subject to special levies or taxes that are built into a commons permanent fund, a form of democratic sovereign wealth fund. So, for example, if the water companies, which I believe should be renationalized, but as long as they are private corporations, they're using our water, they're making profit from our water, they should pay a special levy that goes into the commons fund. Those, for example, who are using North Sea oil or Scottish oil, they're making profit from our commons. Those who are making profits from the potash mine, for example, they're making profits from our commons. There should be special levy put into the fund to build up the fund. And what I'm proposing most of all is that we use ecological taxes to build up the commons. The terrible mistake that Macron made when he raised fuel tax and fossil fuel tax was that he didn't recycle the money to give compensation to the ordinary people, because as he'd introduced it, it is regressive. It increases inequality. But had he said the money that we're raising through that tax would be recycled to give everybody an equal payment, then the poor would not have suffered. They would have benefited. But he paid the price of the Gilets jaunes, and we can see what will happen. I believe we need much higher carbon taxes. I believe we should tax those who are polluting the air, creating toxic air, and compensate those who are losers by putting levies. For example, a frequent flyer levy. People who fly a lot are causing carbon and other particles to go into the air. The people who suffer from that are more than anybody else. We all suffer, but more than anybody else are the low-income people who don't fly, who are living in low-income areas of congestion and pollution near airports and so on. So in a sense, we need a frequent flyer levy that go into the fund that would help build up the capacity for paying out compensation dividends, which is a form of basic income. But the idea in the last chapter is that this commons fund be built, and then from that commons fund, as it's built, more and more could be handed out to everybody equally as a common dividend. Now, in building that, you have to follow what's called the Hartwick rule. The Hartwick rule is that you got to preserve the value of your commons for future generations, as well as for current generations, so that you only distribute the returns on the fund that you can leave the value of the fund constant or building up. And I explain how that would work with the Commons Fund in Chapter 8.
Yeah, and it's a part of the general idea that really comes out of the inequality research, is that if the Piketty relationships that he's established, if these relationships are true, there is simply no way you can counteract the effects just via the secondary distribution, via the tax system. You have to intervene in the primary distribution, and that means basically you have to democratize capital ownership to make sure that the income derived from that capital is not going into the pockets of just a few chosen people at the top, but it's actually spread around society.
Yeah, but I think that Piketty hasn't captured the nature of the commons as such. I mean, his formula is really about how the operation of capitalist economy. But what we're talking about is that a lot of people have witnessed the deliberate taking away of our commons, which are ours. They're ours. And that is an illegitimate profit-making system for which we should be compensated. I think that's a much stronger argument, a moral argument. And it's an argument that is not based on envy. It's not based on saying we want redistribution because some people have been doing better than others because they're cleverer or whatever. So that the right cannot say that what I'm proposing is a matter of envy. It's a matter of common justice, that our commons have been taken away and we should be compensated for that. Yeah. And I think that is a powerful argument that the right cannot answer.
I mean, I think the interesting point is it is exactly the same principle, but you define the best possible starting point, because the starting point is in an area that should not have been commodified in the first place. So you have a very strong moral argument to start here. But it could be basically the starting point for the general principle that you have to redefine capitalism in a way that more people just benefit for it. And the commons, because they shouldn't have been part of the capitalist system to start with, is probably the best starting point to get going.
That is well summarized. Thank you very much, Henning.
Thank you very much. And Guy, I'm sorry. I think that's all, unfortunately, we have time for today. It's been a fascinating discussion, as always, with you. And we'll pick up the thread.
I hope to see you soon.
Okay. Talk to you guys. Henning, thank you very much.
Thank you, Henning. Cheers.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.